Thank you so much for tuning into my show, William Wallace for America. I am grateful that you're spending some time with me today, and I am looking forward to bringing you some what I think is going to be an opinion that most people have, but is not being discussed right now. Eminent Domain. But today's show is brought to you by the Wellness Company. Get a Black Friday deal, 20 to 25%. If you go to twc.health, use my promo code WWFA to get some big discounts. You'll see, if you look down at the bottom of the video, if you're watching the video version, you're going to see my sponsors rolling down there regularly with discounts on some really good things. Let's get started with Eminent Domain right away because I got lots to talk about today. But let's face it, while everybody is looking for the Epstein files or pointing fingers at who's really right or wrong, or blaming Trump, or repeating narratives, or screaming about the differences between facts, their truths, and what the real conspiracies are, government is creeping into the back door to steal your freedoms and liberties while you are screaming at the neighbor to get off of your lawn. But one of those back doors, in my opinion, is eminent domain. And in today's episode, I am going to explain a little bit about eminent domain. I've got a couple articles that I'm going to read, two different descriptions of what eminent domain is, and I'm going to do that to kind of set the table in a way to really kind of get, because I know all of you know what eminent domain is, but I found two articles that have a lot of like alternate information in it, some different pieces of information about eminent domain, and some of them refer to some landmark lawsuits pertaining to eminent domain, which I think are relevant in the understanding of what it really is. And then after I give you a little bit of information there, I'm going to tell you what the founding fathers thought about eminent domain, and I'm going to give you my reason on whether or not I think eminent domain is really in the Constitution or not. I'm going to give you something that I observed. Maybe somebody's already said this, but I haven't. So I want to bring this to you as a unique way to look at it. In my non legal layman's opinion, after decades and generations of government having the right to take our property, is it time to challenge it again? Is it really something that should have been allowed based on interpretation? Look, I get it. There are a lot more people before me and a lot more cases and a lot of other attorneys and government. And I'm just this little guy screaming in the wilderness, it seems sometimes, that on just some opinions. So maybe I have a unique opinion, which I will share with you in a little bit. But as we get started here, I wanted to bring you some of my research. Let's get started on that. Um, as I went through, well, what is eminent domain? A couple articles popped up, which again, I'm going to read to you because I thought they were interesting. One's really short, one's long, but I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to read the highlights, but I'll tell you where to find it. At usconstitution.net, you can find an article on property rights and eminent domain. And it goes to say, and if you're watching the video, you're going to see my eyes following because I'm reading it in the background. Of course, on the podcast, you don't see that. But guess what? There are not going to be any memes in today's episode, nor mimes, by the way. But either way, let's read this. Constitutional basis of eminent domain. It's a power vested in the government. I know I'll hold my opinions, but you can kind of get this in a minute. Eminent domain, a power vested in the government, is rooted in the Fifth Amendment's taking clause. This clause states that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. Historically, this power was seen as an inherent attribute of sovereignty. I'm going to read the Fifth Amendment in just a little bit. And when I do that, and I'll explain why I don't think eminent domain is in there, maybe, just maybe, it'll be a new thought. However, I'm going to read to you what the takings clause is, um, so that way you can see. Here it goes. I pulled up. I said I want to go to another article that says what the takings clause is, and then I'll go back to reading this article because this article is important, but it's not like a story that you're going to have to hear the other part, all of it. Either way, so the takings clause is found in the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, states that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. The overview of the takings clause. The taking clause, the taking tongue twister there, isn't it? The takings clause reads, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This provision is designed to protect property owners from government seizure of their property without fair payment. It acknowledges the government's power to take private property for public use, known as eminent domain, but requires that property owners are to be compensated for their loss. Pardon me for 1 minute, but it doesn't prevent property from being taken. It says that the government has the right to take it as long as they pay you for it, right? I'm going to go into that in just a minute when I read the Fifth Amendment. But right off the bat, how does government have the right to take our property as long as they pay us for it? So people have interpreted this clause to refer to property rights. And I'm explaining in a minute, again, why I don't think this clause pertains to our property rights at all. Back to the article. Constitutional basis of eminent domain at usconstitution.net goes on to say the Supreme Court fully recognized federal eminent domain power in the late 19th century, notably in Cole versus United States. This established eminent domain as essential for national governance, similar to state level authority. So, what was Cole versus United States? I'll pause from the article for just a minute and I will explain the article. I have it. Uh, is this it right here? No, this one is a bad example of it. And we are going to explain what Cole versus United States here is in just a second. Right. So just what was Cole versus, let's go back to that. So the Supreme Court fully recognized federal eminent domain power in the late 19th century, notably in Cole versus United States. This established eminent domain as essential for national governance, similar to state level authority. What was Cole versus United States? Well, I'll read it to you because I almost had it right here. I've got actually a whole bunch of little tabs open at the bottom. So I had to look for just a second. Cole versus United States, 1875, was a landmark Supreme Court case that established the federal government's inherent power of eminent domain to acquire private property for public use. The case arose, and again, when I read the Fifth Amendment to you, I want you to see how does it say that the government can take property, pay you for it, and use it for the for government use or for official use or for the population's use. Think about this. So as I read this, put that in the back of your brain. The case arose when the United States sought to purchase land in Cincinnati for a post office and customs building. The property owners challenged the government's right to condemn the land, arguing that no specific congressional legislation was necessary for such actions. The Supreme Court, remember, I just said yesterday how our courts are gaining control in America based on the opinion of a few. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States, affirming that the federal government can exercise eminent domain to carry out its constitutional functions, reinforcing the principle that property acquisition is a fundamental aspect of government sovereignty. Now, connect that to what I was saying the other day about how our courts are gaining more control in America based on the opinion of a few. I get it. That's why we have a legal system. But now I want you to think back. We are living today in something that was set by the opinion of a jury over 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And now we're living on the opinion of a few judges back then. Put that back in. I'll put that on the shelf for a few minutes, if you will. Now I'll continue with the article. The concept of public use, economic development, sparking nationwide debate and reform. Just compensation remains a fundamental requirement. Through defining and achieving adequacy can be complex, or though defining and achieving adequacy can be complex, the takings clause applies to states through the 14th Amendment. But state level, so now they're saying that, oh, the takings clause, the states can use it, but they can only use it through the 14th Amendment, which I'm also going to read, not the whole amendment to you, just the part of it that pertains to eminent domain. The takings clause applies to states through the 14th Amendment, but state level protections can sometimes exceed federal standards. See, the states get to create their own little thing. Eminent domain in practice. Eminent domain manifests through both federal and state mechanisms. The process typically involves identifying land for public use, negotiating compensation, potentially legal adjudication, sorry. Federal eminent domain often applies to national infrastructure projects. States have their own legislative framework, sometimes offering stronger property owner protections. Private entities, such as public utilities, may also exercise eminent domain when serving public interest. So here lies a problem. The government acquired the power through the Fifth Amendment, which I'll explain why I don't think it applies. And then government has, in many cases, which I'll talk to you about a few later, in many cases, used their powers of eminent domain and inadvertently, we'll say, or casually maybe, and maybe blatantly in some cases, passed on those eminent domain rights onto public utilities, and in some cases, businesses. In the case of Louisiana, when it comes to carbon capture, you'll hear more about that later. But in some cases, pass it on to utilities or businesses. And the people, we've gotten our rights trampled on so often that some people become complacent. Some people just say, oh, well, the government has that right. Well, you see, just like when the judges legislate from the bench and it becomes, precedence, or, becomes a ruling that gets taken, that becomes common law. When the government is doing this and passing those rights on to businesses, we kind of go, well, it was done through government, so it's got to be legal, right? Well, maybe we, the people, have been a little bit too complacent. And you'll find in states around the United States, there's a lot of people who are waking up to the abuses of eminent domain, in their opinion and in mine, I share it too, that have been happening around the country. I'll continue with this. Private entities such as public utilities, we read that. The Kelo versus City of New London case highlighted the complexity of interpreting public use. The court's decision to allow transfer of seized land to a private corporation for economic benefits prompted national discourse and state level legislative assessment. So, what was Kelo versus New London? I will be happy to tell you that here in just a second. The Kelo case. Here we go. The Kelo versus City of New London. It was in 2005. This landmark Supreme case allowed the City of New London, Connecticut, to seize private property for economic development, ruling that such actions served a public purpose. This decision sparked significant backlash and led to legislative changes in many states to protect property owners from similar abuses. This article that I'm reading from is it was examples of eminent domain, which I will. There's some other ones I'm gonna read here in just a minute, but that particular case points to what I was saying earlier, where government is using their power that they obtained, that they say they have in the Fifth Amendment, and has transferred that power to businesses if a business is going to do good. But as in that case of a shopping mall, as it pointed out, for the economic development, we're going to find some other examples of shopping malls and some other things that are really quite egregious when you see that the government took a piece of property from somebody using their eminent domain powers and gave it to a business. It's that they're transferring their rights, which I definitely don't see in the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment. Again, in my layman's opinion, I'm just going to point out something that I see. If you see it too and you agree, then please share this podcast with somebody else. Share the thought with somebody else. I don't want to be the keeper of the thought. I want to transfer it on to other people. But if you disagree with me and you say, no, 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 we should have that right, you agree with the courts, then reach out to me and let me know the same. I'll continue with the article. Similarly, Tyler versus Hennepin County was another one that was of eminent domain that was egregious. I'll read that one too because it's mentioned in usconstitution.net. The Tyler versus Hennepin County is a significant Supreme Court case that addresses the constitutionality of retaining surplus value from the sale of a foreclosed property to satisfy unpaid taxes. So in this example, you're going to see how government said, oh no, we have authority to, through eminent domain to take property, and they've extended it to other things. They've stretched that authority. It's like I've been saying, our governments have been using eminent domain to transfer the wealth to big businesses. Hey, I won't hold my words here. Personally, I think it's for the personal benefit of some elected official who said, hey, we can use eminent domain and transfer this property to this business, and they're going to donate to our campaign to keep us in office, or we'll get a job with them, later when we get out. That's how it works. That's what it's all about. They're doing the hokey pokey on us, and that's what it's all about. Pun intended. My point here is that government is using a sentence in the Fifth Amendment, which I'll explain in a minute, to be able to give itself permission to take property, transfer wealth, take people's rights from them. Tyler versus Hennepin County is a significant Supreme Court case that addresses the constitutionality of retaining surplus value from the sale of a foreclosed property to satisfy unpaid taxes. Okay, using eminent domain, it's not even in there. Case background. Geraldine Tyler owned a condominium in Hennepin County, Minnesota, which she failed to pay property taxes on, accumulating a debt of approximately $15,000. In 2015, Hennepin County foreclosed on her property, sold it for $40,000, and retained the $25,000 surplus from the sale, which exceeded her tax debt. Tyler argued that this retention violated the Fifth Amendment's taking clause and the Eighth Amendment's excessive fines clause. For once, we're going to find out that the Constitution protected somebody. Legal proceedings. Tyler filed a lawsuit against the Hennepin County, claiming that the county's actions constituted an unconstitutional taking of her property without just compensation. The district court dismissed her case, ruling in favor of the county, and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed this decision. Tyler then petitioned the Supreme Court to review the case. The same Supreme Court that gave permission to government to take property via the Fifth Amendment almost 100 years later rules in favor of this woman when it says on May 25th, 2023, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously 9-0 in favor of Miss Tyler, stating that Hennepin County's retention of the surplus value from the sale of her property violated the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. The court held that local governments can only recover the amount owed in unpaid taxes and must provide an opportunity for property owners to reclaim any surplus generated from the sale of their foreclosed property. This example goes a little bit deeper into that eminent domain has not only been the taking of property for a businesses for the better of the community, for something that government needs to benefit everybody in either the country or that area, but that government, once given permission or once allowed to do something, it's going to take more power. That's what government does. Once it gets power, it doesn't stop. It keeps coming at you. And here, somebody found a loophole in the Constitution or interpreted a loophole and is using it against us. And because there's case law or an opinion that becomes common law from some judge or a couple judges, forever we have to live by this? No, we shouldn't. Which is why, as I said in yesterday's podcast, that the judicial system is gaining way too much authority over us in our country and is being able to do things to circumvent the Constitution or using its interpretation and decision create a precedence or precedent. I have somebody who correct me on that, and has something in place that for future generations have to live by. Once again, don't forget about the wellness company, by the way, with their 20 to 25% Black Friday discounts, off discounts or whatever. You got it. twc.health/WWFA. I'm going to continue with this article from the usconstitution.net as I've been kind of jumping off the article to explain things in it. But it's okay because the article isn't a flowing article. It's just information that's been put together. These cases demonstrate eminent domain, the ones I just went through with you. Domain's dual role as a facilitator of public good and a test of property rights protections. The ongoing evolution of legislative and judicial approaches continues to shape the constitutional landscape. Challenges and controversies of eminent domain. Key controversies in eminent domain include equity theft, where the state retains surplus value from seized property, as in the previous case we just pointed out. But then what happens when they're bringing up equity? What's going to happen if the government needs property in a poor neighborhood or from a minority neighborhood? Are they going to give them the same value as they would somebody else? I'm just throwing it out there. I know I'm stirring the pot a little bit. I get it. But either way, equity theft, what is that supposed to mean? Are we talking about the government is now getting involved in um, equitable eminent domain. Is there such a thing? Where the state retains surplus from seized property. Regulatory takings, where regulations diminish property value without triggering compensation. I'm going to get to an opinion I have on this later, but either way, when they, in this case, where regulations that involve eminent domain become involved, a lot of people lose their property value. The Tyler versus Hennepin County case highlighted issues with authorities retaining profits beyond tax due. Yeah, I went over that a minute ago. Regulatory takings often impact economically disadvantaged or senior citizens, potentially leading to home loss. Again, eminent domain has its tentacles in more aspects of our lives than what the interpretation by the Supreme Court was 125 years ago, let alone what it said in the Fifth Amendment, in my opinion, which I'll discuss in a little bit. Back to the article, public reactions to eminent domain cases have varied. The Kelo decision sparked nationwide reevaluation of state laws, with over 40 states reforming their eminent domain statutes to more strictly define public use and ensure adequate compensation, which is another case that I went over with a minute ago. The Kelo case was the one where the Supreme Court allowed New London, Connecticut to seize property in 2005 for economic development. However, these reforms lack consistency across jurisdictions. Back to my point, the opinions of judges, reflecting the challenge of balancing constitutional sovereignty with evolving societal needs and urban expansions. How can we ensure that eminent domain practices honor both the constitutions and the state versus federal authority? The division of eminent domain power between state and federal governments reflects the federalist structure established by the Constitution. Federal eminent domain is tied to enumerated powers, typically focusing on national interests like defense or interstate commerce. States have broader authority under general police powers, allowing them to respond more dynamically to local needs. However, the takings clause applies to states through the 14th Amendment. Don't see it in there, or hint, you won't see it in there either. Ensuring alignment with principles of justice and public necessity. As we finish up here, this article, state constitutions often extend eminent domain protections beyond federal minimums, showcasing, i.e., I'll give you my opinion on that, beyond federal minimums, because the states are more inclined to transfer their eminent domain rights to business and industry, especially when that business and industry is going to bring, quote, jobs or tax dollars to keep local governments going. Back to the article, showcasing diverse interpretations of property rights. This allows for more specific approaches that respect local autonomy while upholding national national standards of fairness. How can lawmakers and judiciary members maintain the balance between local prerogatives and unified standards of fairness in eminent domain cases? What role do state constitutions play in shaping this balance? Future directives and legislative proposals, future eminent domain reforms should focus on refining existing frameworks and establishing clear directives. Key areas for improvements include defining public use more precisely to constrain broad interpretations, creating uniform standards for appraising compensation, particularly in regulatory takings cases, establishing a centralized forum for property owners to seek redress, streamlining dispute resolution, reevaluating eminent domain's compatibility with modern environmental standard and technological realities, educating the public and policymakers about the fundamental role of property rights in a republic. These reforms should remain noted or rooted in an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, which, when I read this to you in a few minutes, you might see what I see. Maybe I'm the smarter guy in the room, right? That I might have an opinion that nobody else has had. I doubt it, but I think it's time to bring it back up. Either way, balancing individual freedoms with public progress is a is a proposed reform. How can Congress effectively implement these changes while respecting the constitutional vision of limited government intervention? Eminent domain embodies a tension between governmental authority and individual property rights. Property rights should always be first when it comes to the individual. As we consider its future, how can we ensure that progress aligns with the Constitution's principles, preserving the balance between public needs and personal freedoms? And that is that article. And this one is just going to be a quick read on eminent domain and what it's about. Eminent domain abuse. No, and this article that I think is important, or this interpretation, I'm gonna read this for just a couple minutes, is at investopedia.com. Eminent domain explain types, compensations, and legal implications. It's a long article, but I'm gonna read some of the highlights that I think are important. Eminent domain is the power of the government to take private property. Never thought anyway. I'll Eminent domain is the power of the government to take private property and put it into public use. I was going to go in another direction with that. But in exchange for just compensation. This is practice is that's how it reads this. It doesn't read right. This is practice is established by the US Constitution, but it also occurs in many other countries under different names. Seized property is often used for public works or infrastructure projects. Property owners can typically sue to keep their property or demand more compensation. As we continue, understanding key aspects of eminent domain, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution grants the right of eminent domain. Many countries have similar properties. Exploring various types of property seizure in eminent domain, the government determines how your property will be used. Each category of use is taken, used, and compensated differently. Property owners often have little to say how their property is seized and may hesitate to engage in lengthy legal battles. What is complete taking in eminent domain? You can figure that out. Understanding partial property seizure in a partial taking under eminent domain, only part of the property is taken. Exploring temporary property seizure, impacts of regulatory taking on property rights. This is one's important. Regulatory taking can be broken down into two sections: total regulatory taking and partial regulatory taking. A total regulatory taking occurs when a regulation affects a property to such a degree that it cannot be used. A partial regulatory taking occurs when a regulation affects the property as well, but does not cause it to lose all of its value, only a substantial portion. I'm going to read this again for the people in Louisiana who are fighting carbon capture. I'll discuss that for 1 second because this is a spot where it's important. Legislative body many years ago voted for carbon capture. I'm making a long story very short. Now, the people in Louisiana are finding out how much in peril their property rights are to that vote that happened to allow companies to pump carbon underneath their property using eminent domain. Remember, the government has now transferred their eminent domain rights to businesses to pour or to pump carbon capture underneath their properties through that eminent domain, and it has caused them to not be able to use some of their mineral rights, or that's the fear, which I believe that is a real fear. And as a result, the people now say, wait a minute, we don't want this because we don't want to lose our mineral rights. We don't want to have our property contaminated, and we don't want to have this being done and not be compensated for it. Once again, impacts of regulatory taking on property rights for my Louisiana friends. Regulatory taking can be broken down into two sections: total regulatory taking and partial regulatory taking. A total regulatory taking occurs when a regulation affects a property to such a degree that it cannot be used. A partial regulatory taking occurs when a regulation affects the property as well, but does not cause it to lose all of its value, only a substantial portion. How fair compensation is determined in eminent domain, identifying and understanding misuse of eminent domain. We've talked about some of that. Essential insights into inverse condemnation. What if I refuse eminent domain? There are some clear guidelines for eminent domain. They are that the property will serve public purpose, that just compensation is offered, and that property is acquired. The most that most property owners can hope for is high market valuation, or to engage in a lawsuit, which they will probably lose. Why is eminent domain in the Fifth Amendment? I'm going to read this because I'm getting ready to tell you why I don't think it is in the Fifth Amendment. Eminent domain is in the Fifth Amendment to ensure that the U.S. government is able to acquire assets, not in the Constitution, that benefit the public good. An example of this, which is also not in the Constitution, an example of this would be if a town needed water and the only possible way to bring water to that town was through the property of a private landowner. The landowner may not want pipes running through their property, but since it is a benefit to the public, the government will pursue it. Has anyone ever won an eminent domain case? Um, they don't answer yes or no. They kind of tell you that most private property owners find it easier to just accept the value. As a matter of fact, what they're really saying is they just roll over and take the money and go away and forget about it because they got an extra couple dollars in their pocket. Why do I protect my property from eminent domain? The bottom line, this article, you can read the full thing at investopedia.com. Eminent domain explained: types, compensation, and legal implications. I wanted to go over the highlights because I think they're important to my thought, which I'm getting ready to share with you in a minute. What did our founding fathers say? This is I guess deserves a drum roll, if you will, and proverbial speaking, I guess. But what did the founding fathers say about eminent domain? What did the Federalist Papers say about eminent domain? And I'm going to read that to you. The Federalist Papers. In the Federalist Papers, the concept of eminent domain is not explicitly addressed, but it is implied through the discussion of government power and property rights. The Fifth Amendment, which, not to discredit, I'm definitely not discrediting the Federalist Papers, because I think when you read our Constitution and you read the Constitution as the result of lots of debate and lots of debate that happened through the Federalist Papers, I think the Federalist Papers gives a lot more explanation. But I don't know that this is a real explanation of something that was written in the Federalist Papers as much as it is an opinion. So please follow me on that. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which includes the Takings Clause, outlines that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. which is a key aspect of eminent domain. The Supreme Court has recognized the federal government's power to take private property for public use, particularly in cases like Cole versus United States. The Federalist Papers, it doesn't point to any Federalist paper. It doesn't point to anything that was actually said in the Federalist paper. So while I think, and what I'm reading, and I've researched, there's nothing said in the Federalist Papers about that the government should have the right to eminent domain. It just says here the concept of eminent domain is not explicitly addressed in the Federalist Papers, but is implied through the discussion of the government power and property rights in the Fifth Amendment, which, when I read you the Fifth Amendment here in a minute, I'll let you decide if you agree with me or not. So what does the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment say in here? Well, I'm going to read it to you here. I've got my pocket constitution from the Leadership Institute right here handy. The Fifth Amendment, you know what? I'm gonna let that be a teaser. I'm gonna do the 14th Amendment, which is what's first. Then I'll read you the Fifth Amendment because I have more to say on that. The 14th Amendment has a lot of things. It's kind of funny because the 14th Amendment has a hodgepodge of stuff. The 14th Amendment, Part 1, talks about the naturalization, which we hear a lot about. I'm not going to read that. Number 2 talks about representatives and how they shall be appointed. Nothing about property rights. 3, that no person shall be a senator or a representative in Congress, an elector. It kind of talks about those qualifications. Number 4, it talks about the validity of the public debt. Again, a hodgepodge of things in here. But it doesn't really ever say anything about property rights. It does say that, number 5, that Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provision of this article. So once again, in the 14th Amendment, talks about naturalization, representation, and so after reading to you the 1 through 5 of Article 14, at first glance, you don't hear it. Neither do I, or I don't hear it. Do you? But after rereading a little bit more and going a little bit further, we find buried in here in the 14th Amendment this line that I'll read from the top. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Okay? No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Somehow or another, after they talk about naturalization, they bring up life, liberty, or property, and somehow or another, they're saying that this line in the 14th Amendment applies to states being able to use their rights to take your property. I don't know about you, but why would they bury a line that has been interpreted by a judge or a jury or a court for future generations to live by out of this one line that's buried after the naturalization? Using that concept or that thought that we are now talking about naturalization, and then they talk about life, liberty, or property. Let's go to the Fifth Amendment, which is where they originally felt that eminent domain was located, which I believe, in my opinion, that I've been leading up to and teasing you about, has said it means nothing about eminent domain. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. They are saying that that one line, which they refer to as the takings clause, means that the government has the right to take your property. Nowhere in here is eminent domain mentioned. Nowhere in here does it talk about the government taking your property. However, here is why I think it doesn't fit. Here's why I think that this should not translate to the taking of private property. Because they talk about a person incriminating himself, pleading the fifth, not incriminating himself, which to me implies that if they are to be found guilty still and all after this, that only then would the government have a right to take their property, but not without just compensation. To me, this area refers more to the Tyler case where the woman lost her property because she didn't pay her property taxes, but after her taxes were paid, they returned the rest of the money to her because that was fair compensation under the Eighth Amendment. But now, somehow or another, some judge interpreted that one line to be a takings clause to refer to eminent domain, not mentioned in here at all whatsoever. The other reason I feel that this does not pertain, that this should not be considered eminent domain, is that our founding fathers created the Constitution to constrain government, to take power away from government and give it back to the people. The founding fathers believed in property rights, not the government right to take your property. So somehow or another, that line has gotten interpreted to be eminent domain, that now the government has the right to take your property, when after the original part of the Fifth Amendment is talking about self-incrimination, pleading the fifth, as they say, and they go to that they're not going to take that, and I'll read it again, that the government, the witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property. So they're talking about his rights of self-defense, not the Second Amendment, of course, to not incriminate himself or be a witness against himself, as it said, nor to be deprived of his life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall property be taken for public use without just compensation. That, to me, they're referring more to the punishment if they were found guilty in a case than it refers to the government having the right to take your property. Eminent domain is not mentioned. The government coming in and taking your property for the betterment of the community or for public use is not mentioned. Our founding fathers themselves never, ever, ever, ever did our founding fathers say that the government should have enough power to take people's rights or freedoms away. That was the whole reason for the that was the whole reason for the Bill of Rights. It was the whole reason for our Constitution, to restrain government, to take power away from a government, or to not give power to a government, but to give power to the people. That was the whole idea of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And yet somehow or another, because some judges way back in their opinion, figured that they've now given power to not only the federal government, but to state governments to take our property rights away. And I'm going to double down on this. What did some of our founding fathers say about property rights? Which will further make my point that our founding fathers, it's not in the Federalist Papers about eminent domain that the government should have the right. There was plenty of conversation. We all know it. If you study history, you've learned it, that the founding fathers wanted a government that works for the people, run by the people, not a government that has control over the people or can take our rights. Again, that's why they have the Bill of Rights. The discussions they had were like this by James Madison. A government is instituted to protect property of every sort, this being the end of government. That alone is a just government, which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. John Adams. The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. If thou shalt not covet, and thou shalt not steal, were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free. John Jay. Know then that we consider ourselves and do insist that we are and ought to be as free as our fellow subjects in Britain, and that no power on earth has a right to take our property from us without our consent. Of course, the Supreme Court justices 125 years ago, deeming the takings clause as a reason to be able to use something called eminent domain, which is not in our Constitution. And as long as it's fair and just when payment is our consent. So yeah, we can consent by taking money with just compensation, and accepting the money being our consent to give over our property. But for the government to say, we are taking your property, here's some money, that doesn't make it right. Them offering us money for what they are going to take anyway doesn't make it right. You're forced to take the money. So you're forced to give them the property. You're forced to take the money. But we're supposed to feel like, yeah, when we took the money, it's our consent. No, that's the chicken coming out, or the egg coming after the chicken. Them taking your property, you might not want to sell. Sure, the money, get the money, it's fine, but it's different. Eminent domain being transferred to big industry like it's being done in Louisiana and all over the place is a transfer of the government's rights to a business, when eminent domain, in my opinion, isn't even in there. And the last one I'm going to read by George Mason, that elections of members to serve as representatives of the people in assembly ought to be free, and that all men having sufficient evidence of permanent common interest with and attachment to the community have the right of suffrage and cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected, nor bound by any law to which they have not in like manner assembled for the public good. That was by George Mason. Once again, when you look up what the founding fathers are saying about property rights, nowhere in there did they make any inference to eminent domain or that the government should be allowed to a takings clause to take your property as long as it's just compensated. They believed that property rights were sacred and violate to the human, and that they were paramount, not paramount, but they were the same as our creator's rights to us, endowed to us by our creator, that is. that here, none of the founding fathers believed that the government should ever have the right to take your property or your freedoms or your liberty. But somehow or another, our Supreme Court has justified it. And of course, our government has justified it since then because of some interpretation. Of course, when things get interpreted a certain way, many people go, oh, yeah, I do see it that way. And then the judge comes along and says, yep, I see it that way too. Rubber stamps it. It's now common law, and forever we have to live by it. Is it time to challenge eminent domain? Is it time to bring it back up? Maybe there are some cases where the government needs it. I don't know. I get it. And maybe there needs to be another avenue for it. But the government has run amok with our rights. The government has taken it to the extreme. The government has taken their ability and now they're transferring it to corporations and other entities as a way that the people are losing their freedoms and their liberties. The founding fathers were about personal rights and private property rights and individual liberties and restraining government, not about giving a back door for government to our personal rights. The problem also is that when regular people become elected, they become bureaucrats, that they are, they that they become employees of a corporation, if you will, and they start to work harder for the perpetuation of government than for the individual rights, all in the name of the greater good and their next election. They see the making of deals with businesses, or in many cases, the transferring of the government's eminent domain rights as ways to fund more government and keep them in business, keep government in business, that is, even if it means infringing on an individual's property rights or the diminishing of their rights and money when those eminent domain rights next door, so to speak, encroach on their property rights with the building of a business or something right next door to theirs. Eminent domain has become a tool for politicians to profit from by giving business deals that will empower them and create an income for government while helping the politicians stay in office and gain more power, and also allows government to gain more power, especially when government takes it and gives it to a shopping mall, for instance, which I'll give you some examples of eminent domain abuses that have happened around the country. Las Vegas widow's property in the mid 1990s, a widow lost her inherited commercial property in Las Vegas when the city claimed the area was blighted to justify its use of eminent domain. The widow was not properly notified of the hearing regarding her property, leading to her loss without adequate compensation. Toledo Chrysler manufacturing plant, which brings up something very important, brings up a point that I wanted to say, is that the city of Toledo, Ohio, declared several well-maintained homes and businesses as slums to facilitate, you see, government said, oh, because local governments pass laws, we elect these guys. Of course, they run as they're going to work hard for the people and do the right thing, freedom, liberty. They get in office, they pass laws for the greater good. They use those laws to transfer power to their wealthy donors and keep themselves in office. Back to the story. Although the city promised significant job creation, the actual number of jobs, have we heard this before? The actual number of jobs provided was far less than anticipated, raising concerns about the legitimacy of the eminent domain claim. The point I wanted to make on this story is, so if the government uses eminent domain to take your property and they say, oh, it's worth a lump sum of X here, maybe you take them to court and you get a plus Y in there. They don't give you any residuals on it. They're not get so if the government in these politicians' minds, they transfer using eminent domain to some business, and the business is making money off of property that was once yours, and they're making money off of it forever and ever and ever and ever, and then later they sell the property at a profit. Do you get residuals on that? Nope. It's not in the takings clause, nor is eminent domain in the takings clause. Again, I'm doubling down on something. The Fifth Amendment goes into not incriminating yourself. My opinion on that is that the government, if they found you guilty, is not going to be allowed to take your property without just compensation. Just me. Two more examples. Texas real estate company. A real estate company in Texas used eminent domain to take over 127 homes to expand a private mall. The case exemplifies how eminent domain can be misused for private benefit rather than genuine public use. I gave another example also. Here's another example about another shopping mall in Syracuse, New York. The Onondaga County Industrial Development Agency used eminent domain to acquire the remaining land parcels from two private developers. An appellate division in Rochester ruled this decision should allow the organization to move forward with plans to create a 65-acre community, which plans show could include a movie theater, retail stores, and a residential component. How in the world is that for the greater good or for public use? I get that the public's going there, but it sounds to me like the public's going to be using it for the greater good, wink, wink. So we're going to use eminent domain to transfer it to some investors who are going to develop it. And when they make a bunch of money, they'll probably donate to our campaigns. But another point to make when it comes to eminent domain, when somebody runs for office, freedom, liberty for the people, they get in office, they become a bureaucrat. They see government as something that they have to continue to run like a business and keep the money flowing so tax dollars continue to support government. I get it. We need government services. We need sewage. We need water. We need police. We need firemen. I get it. However, it grows beyond the basic needs of our community when they do things like this of transferring their eminent domain ability, not rights, because eminent domain really isn't a right because they've interpreted that right from the Fifth Amendment, which never even says anything about eminent domain in the Fifth Amendment. I know I'm repeating purposely, but they transfer their access to eminent domain and transfer it to businesses in the name of public use, but the private property owner doesn't get residuals on that or the benefits. And public use, that business could easily go buy some other property someplace else for that. The last example, Iowa farmland for Dakota Access Pipeline, another example that I think shows where the people should have gotten residuals. The Iowa Utilities Board permitted the condemnation. I get quick sometimes. You have to hang on. I apologize. Sometimes I get in a flow and I get excited and passionate and speak a little bit too fast. The Iowa Utilities Board permitted the condemnation of privately owned farmland to build the Dakota Access Pipeline, replacing several families and raising questions about the public necessity of such projects. These examples illustrate the potential for abuse in the exercise of eminent domain, highlighting the need for legal safeguards to protect property owners' rights. Once again, where the residuals for the people. This, my friends, is some of the examples when eminent domain gets used for recurring income. Why aren't citizens getting residual checks on that? My friends, I have kind of went on about this, about my interpretation of the Fifth Amendment. I don't claim to be a constitutional scholar or even an attorney. I just claim to be somebody that does a lot of observation, does a lot of eyebrow raising, looks at things, notices things, and really kind of looks out for our freedoms and liberties. I, I on my I use my critical thinking skills and my freedom colored glasses instead of rose colored glasses. I try to look at things in a freedom liberty perspective. Where are we losing freedom and liberty? Where does it say it in our Constitution? You hear these references to the Constitution very frequently from elected officials that like to quote things in the Constitution to make themselves look smarter or empower themselves in a way that they say, well, I'm better than that elected official because I can quote this thing from the Constitution. And it elevates them in some people's minds. Some people, oh, well, they know the Constitution just because they're saying it. Jurisprudence, common law, the opinions of judges that legislate from the bench all create precedents, all create, and I might have said that wrong, forgive me, all create something that future generations point to and say, well, see, eminent domain was allowed in this case to build a shopping mall. So it should be able to be done here too, and here and there and there. A subdivision by this developer was allowed because they were able to take the property because the subdivision is going to have a movie theater on it that the public is going to use. Government finds ways to encroach on our liberties and freedoms constantly. We just have to look at it. We have to get to know our Constitution better. I may not be interpreting it correctly, but the way I look at it and read it over and over again, eminent domain's not mentioned in the Fifth Amendment. It's not mentioned in the 14th Amendment. It alludes to property rights and government not have, but it doesn't say it explicitly that the government should have the right to buy somebody's property using the force of government or eminent domain as the proper definition or the proper term for it. If you agree with me, please share this podcast. Let others read it. Let it motivate you. We need to start talking about this more because we have seen a government that's growing in power. It's more egregious. It's ignoring the rights of people. We have to get to know our Constitution more, but we have to get to know our rights even better. And we have to start talking about this more. Don't ignore it that, well, the government and the legislative process. So for my friends in Louisiana, let this motivate you to stay involved in the process of fighting the use of eminent domain over our property rights. People around the country, get to know your property rights. Fight this, okay? Because if we let the government know that we're paying attention, all we really need to do is find a court that will agree with us on this, if that's the case where it goes, or that's where this goes in a case. Again, please, if you agree, share the podcast. If you don't agree, tell me I'm stupid. I don't care. It's my opinion. I'm just looking out for freedom and liberty. And even if I'm wrong, I am doing something to bring awareness on our rights as a way to protect them in the future. If we're not talking about it, we're ignoring it. If we're not talking about it, we're being complacent. And if we're being complacent, the government is going to grow and find more loopholes to get into the back door of our house and steal our property rights, our freedoms, and our liberties. Please go visit some of my sponsors. Also, check out the wellness company Check out Patriot Mobile. Get 2 months free with Holiday 25, but don't forget to tell them that William Wallace sent you. Thank you so much. God bless you. God bless America. And thank you so much. And tune in to my next podcast, which will be very soon.